were going to set apartheid South Africa ablaze so we could build something new.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence.
The place of the reckoning, Pretoria. A short drive from the Rivonia suburb of Johannesburg, where the authorities arrested the trialists, capturing a mountain of evidence. On July the 11th, 1963, police raided Liliesleaf, a safe house that had become unsafe, arresting most of the leaders of the South African underground, paralysing the movement. They included Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada and Dennis Goldberg. Arthur Goldreich was arrested here with his family. Along with lawyer Harold Walpe, he escaped from police cells in Johannesburg to Botswana. The rest stood trial here under the threat of death, a trial that would sway world opinion, a world that would soon make up its mind whether they were criminals or patriots fighting for change. The setting, the Palace of Justice.
I think it's beautiful, especially this one and the three old courts is beautiful. I love antiques and I love wood, lead glass or stained glass. It's beautiful, and of course everything has been repaired. Even the doors, when I came in there, at the back there's a door where the judge comes in.
For decades, this lavish building was a potent symbol of the confidence in permanence of the apartheid establishment. Many of those who clashed with that ideal found themselves standing in this dock. Outside, Paul Kruger, the former president of the Transvaal who laid the first stone back in 1895, stands with a new multiracial South Africa at his feet. Inside, the courtrooms are back at work. They were considered too small and were abandoned in 1993. They fell into disrepair. The government poured millions into restoration to their former glory, right down to the floor tiles from the British company that made the originals more than a century ago. This was the setting for South Africa's trial of the century. The Rivonia trial resonated around the world and made Nelson Mandela a household name.
You would have sat here, because this is where the accused normally sit, because they go down to the cells immediately from here.
A trial in which these famous words captured its essence.
I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination.
The words of Nelson Mandela, accused number 1. Number 2, Walter Sisulu, Dennis Goldberg, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, Lionel Bernstein, Raymond Mhlaba, James Cantor, Elias Motsoaledi, and Andrew Mlangeni. A number of the accused were fresh from the so-called treason trial held here at this synagogue just around the corner from the Palace of Justice. Tile Pile, a political activist and advocate, works at the nearby Palace of Justice. His grandmother, a staunch activist, was at the treason trial every day for 4 years.
She was the person that had organized the feeding of all the treason trialists. I think there were 110 of them that started off, and she would feed them every tea time at 11:15, tea and sandwiches, and every lunchtime she would provide a meal for them throughout the duration of the treason trial. They gave her a sari in the colors of the ANC. That's with my aunt in Canada at the moment, and they gave her a letter showing their appreciation, and the letter invites her to a lunch sometime when freedom is obtained.
That freedom appeared light years away when the Rivonia Triallists stood in this dock. Treason failed to put them away. The treason charge, with its requirement for 2 witnesses for each fact and the onus on the prosecution, proved too complicated. This time round, the state wanted a clear-cut result.
They really created a new, very serious offense, sabotage, which covered bringing a pylon down, damaging a railway line, making a speech, writing a poem and sending it to your girlfriend, criticizing the government. All this was sabotage. 5 years minimum, as if it were treason, which included the death sentence as a maximum.
On October the 9th, 1963, the accused faced more than 200 charges of sabotage dating back to December 1961. They included everything from bombing post offices and pylons right down to putting a burning cigarette into a postbox. Accused number 1, Nelson Mandela, was already serving 5 years for inciting strikes and leaving the country illegally.
We're taken to court the first time to be charged. Nelson Mandela's in short pants and a khaki houseboy's jacket. That's the only thing to describe it. And sandals and handcuffs. You're not supposed to humiliate a prisoner in front of a judge, but they did this to him. And I was standing next to him. He was a convicted prisoner, and I had a chocolate in my pocket. And I nudged him, and he looked down at this chocolate and went. And so I broke off a little square of chocolate, put it in his hand, and he wiped his handcuffed hands over his face, and the chocolate disappeared into the corner of his very, very thin cheek. And gradually, here we're being charged with sabotage, and they're going to hang us. And this little bit of chocolate melts away. And when it had gone, he gave me a nudge, and I gave him some more until the chocolate had disappeared. Because you don't have sweetness in prison. And for me, this is such a moment of humanity. But even more was Nelson succumbing to the temptation of the chocolate. But standing there, gathering himself, he'd lost a terrible amount of weight. His clothes hung on him now. But demanding of the judge to look him in the eye.
A lot of the time, Judge Quartus de Wet was looking down at applications by the defence. One of these applications called for the indictment to be quashed on the grounds it was flimsy and vague.
The indictment was quashed. Once the indictment is quashed, you are free. But we knew we can't be free, you know. But we took advantage and we started walking out of the dock, and immediately we were rearrested. So it was a brief few minutes. You can't even call it freedom.
And at that point, I wasn't going to go down to the cells because I'm free. And a cop came along, Dirk, and started pushing me down the stairs, and they're very steep. So I put the brakes on, and I gave him my elbow in his gut. It sank in a long way.
They were soon back in court. Up against them was the deputy prosecutor of the Transvaal, Percy Utah, the son of a Cape Town butcher who had worked his way up single-mindedly through the legal profession. He saw this trial as a big break. Defence team member George Bezos spent months watching him in action.
He quoted some of the English great writers and regretted that he did not have their pen to write about the seriousness of the treachery of, he got carried away. He didn't cross-examine.
Percy Utah laid on the prosecution case with a trowel. The accused were planning a civil war and what he called a violent and hellish revolution. Without sparing any drama, Utah claimed the men in the dock had enough explosives to blow up the whole of Johannesburg.
Percy Utah, during the trial, he would make some sally, sort of attempting to ridicule Walter Sisulu or Governor Mbeki, who were miles ahead of him intellectually. And he would turn round and smile for applause to the security police. And when they had presented evidence against me, the cops would turn around to me and go, and I had to decide how to answer, and I gave them a finger like that.
The prosecution boasted it had a pile of evidence, including a ream of Nelson Mandela's papers that his comrades forgot to hide at Liliesleaf. Under the threat of death, they stood defiant, arguing that it was the government that should be in the dock.
As Mandela told us, he was a lawyer, of course, that chaps, this is not a legal trial, this is a political trial. We cannot show weakness. We must not be apologetic. Where there is evidence, genuine evidence, we must admit it. If there is no genuine evidence, we must confront that.
The case against us is very strong, I know that. And if they're going to hang us, why give them any information? I'm going to die anyway. They're not going to let me off. The hatred is clear. And the hatred of whites who were involved in the movement for African liberation was intense.
Ron Anderson spent his life working as a journalist. In 1964, he was a court reporter on The Star in Johannesburg and covered every day of the Rivonia trial. This is the fruit of his labour.
I had a shorthand of a sort, which is now, of course, today, shorthand's unheard of. And we had a telephone on a pillar just outside the court, locked in a little box. And all this material I dictated, rushed from the court, read from my shorthand notes, and dictated that to typists who could type very, very fast.
One of the stories he dictated down the telephone belonged to a witness who knocked the Rivonia Triallists cold. The man was a former activist called Bruno Matolo. They called him Witness X.
This man, whether he rehearsed his evidence for weeks on end, but he had an incredible memory of everything he'd done, what meetings he'd attended, what the accused had said to him, what Sisulu said here, when he went to Natal, what happened here and what happened there, and what documents were given to him at the time. I don't think I've ever heard a better witness. He was astonishingly effective, and he himself had been involved in about 30 sabotage acts, letting off little homemade bombs here and there and everywhere, and so it was a pretty easy case for the prosecution.
The prosecution also pulled out another unlikely witness. Police arrested Bob Heppel at Liliesleaf with everyone else. He was a lawyer and a communist activist. In his other life, he was the son of a well-to-do lawyer who was friends with leading politician John Vorster.
Bob Heppel told us that his dad, Alex Heppel, had been to see Vorster because they'd been members of parliament together, knew each other. And Alex told Bob that Vorster had said they're going to hang him. And it's a hell of a pressure for a father to put on his son, you know. And Bob said he believed them, it's true. And later he told us he was thinking of being a state witness. And Rusty said, if you do that, people will cross the street to avoid you.
This risk he took. It was a crushing blow to the defence team and its leader, Bram Fischer.
It was a stab to Bram Fischer's heart. Bob's father and mother were Bram's and Molly's friends. Bram never believed that he would weaken. But he was tortured and weakened and decided to make a statement.
And I was then subjected to 3 days and nights of continuous interrogation, which was along the lines of being made to stand, you couldn't go to the toilet. Swanepoel, who was one of the two interrogators, would play Russian roulette. He had a revolver on the table. And he'd say, well, what's it going to be? This. He would spin the barrel and he'd say, you're going to try this or you're going to have the rope.
More than 40 years on, Sir Bob Heppel is an academic in Britain, the country he fled to a lifetime ago. The former activist and prisoner now has a knighthood from the Queen and also a measure of guilt.
In my own mind, I was satisfied that I hadn't given any evidence, first of all, against other people who were still active in the country, and secondly, that I hadn't incriminated the people I was arrested with further than they were. It maybe confirmed things. I did feel very guilty about it because I felt I shouldn't have done it. But I mean, that's with the benefit of hindsight.
Either way, the word in the cells under the Palace of Justice was that all would be found guilty. And all were likely to hang. For months, this courtroom heard furious argument over the fate of the Rivonia Triallists. Outside, large crowds grew.
We were tremendously encouraged by people who were coming there in large numbers.
The state gave everybody an opportunity to be at the same place at the same time, which gave them an opportunity to talk about the struggle and the way forward during the Rivonia trial and after the Rivonia trial, which was one of the unintended consequences of the trial, I think.
Photographer Alf Kumwalo, who has spent a lifetime in journalism, was there watching and taking pictures as the crowd swelled and the death sentence loomed.
There were moving scenes, a lot of moving scenes. Mrs. Mandela was there, the old lady was worried. At one stage she was sobbing when she thought her child, that's how she put it, meaning Mandela, her child was going to be sentenced to death.
Winnie Mandela, the wife of accused number one, was also in the thick of it.
Winnie used to get there in Xhosa traditional and get a lot of press, but the security police hated that. But the way she stood with that fist, with the fist up, just there was total attention on her. Yeah. But the funny thing was that even Mandela, an old lady like Mandela's mother, was also viewed like a terrorist.
The pressure was mounting inside the court too. The prosecution called the defendants everything from Russian agents to terrorists, and they fought back. Lawyer George Bezos was a young member of the defense team.
When you have Nelson Mandela dealing with these allegations without actually repeating them, but saying by way of contrast that we are the patriots, we are the Democrats. Whites don't have anything to fear from us.
With the verdict near, it was decided that Nelson Mandela would make an address from the dock. It took 4 hours and went down in history.
It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But if it needs be, it is an idea for which I am prepared to die.
That statement of Mandela, for example, of I'm prepared to die if need be, it's all our view. It's not just his, although it's attributed to him alone, but it was our view, all of us.
He's saying, Judge, hang me, hang Walter, hang Dennis, hang Govan, hang us all. And my feeling was one of pride, to be there, with a person of such elegant certainty. He had elegance, Nelson, you know. I'm not a believer in the cult of the personality. But at that moment, there was real greatness.
Judge Quartus de Wet handed down the verdict on June the 11th, 1964, guilty. The only question was, were they going to hang? In the cells beneath the court, everyone was concerned.
Nelson standing there, taking me aside, and saying, Dennis, When you try to teach people about Marxism, don't talk about Europe and slavery and feudalism. Our people don't understand that. You have to talk about it, about our own country and our own history and experience. And I say, Nell, why are you telling me this? He says, no, I just think you should know this. It's very important to know this. I knew what he was thinking, that he was going to be hanged.
Before sentence, an unexpected plea for mitigation came from the world of literature. Liberal author Alan Paton, who wrote Cry of the Beloved Country, spoke up for the men in the dock.
Here was an international figure saying that he came to give evidence because he loves his country. He said that he knew Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Govan Mbeki. He knew them as honest, peace-loving men who had been forced to take up arms.
And he was subjected to a brutal cross-examination by Percy Yutar. He made it quite clear to Alan Paton that he was just there to appeal for clemency because no one was listening to these people and that they deserved a hearing, they deserved some consideration for their political beliefs. And he was asking just for clemency. Then Percy Yutar attacked him and tried to make him out to be someone who supported violence. He tried to make out that he supported economic boycotts.
Yutar was ready with his security police file. He insulted him, he accused him of lying, he accused him of being party to the conspiracy to overthrow the state.
This lost the prosecution many friends. In newspapers around the world, the tide of opinion was turning in favour of the accused.
You had the New York Times calling them the Washingtons and Benjamin Franklins of South Africa.
As liberals rallied to the cause, it was the stuffy old colonialists who held sway. To this day, defence lawyer George Bezos believes the British government used its influence to save the necks of the Rivonia Triallists. He had a drink with the British Consul General in Johannesburg just before the sentence.
He was drinking one whiskey after the other until about 11 o'clock when I thought that it was time for me to go. His wife was there and he saw me to the door and said, George, there's not going to be a death sentence. And Rusty Bernstein is going to be acquitted. I didn't think it was my part to cross-examine him. How do you know? He put his arm around my shoulders. He said, you go and have a good night's sleep.
Among the first to see the confirmation in black and white was journalist Ron Anderson, who happened to be at the Palace of Justice on the eve of sentencing, where officials were printing the judgment.
And the one said, do you want to buy the judgment? And I was astonished. And so for 10 rands I bought a copy. And now I had the whole judgment the day before it was given. And I was petrified I'd get caught with this thing. So secretly I went to the office and I typed out the whole final version of the story. And then the next day when the court was actually sitting, I didn't actually have to write anything, so I took along a junior reporter and I made him pretend to write, to show, you know, to try and indicate that we didn't have the judgment, that we were actually reporting it, whereas meanwhile it was all in type already, been set. And then as the day went on, I would phone and say, you can release this section, you can release that section, you can release that section.
But the men on trial were in the dark as they climbed these steps on June the 12th, 1964.
So we go into court fully expecting to be hanged. And when the judge just about whispers, life sentence, I didn't even hear it until Dennis shouted to the crowd there, life. So there was a collective sigh of relief that we are not going to die. Whatever life sentence meant at that time, we subsequently learned that life for political prisoners was going to be life.
And then we smiled at each other, and then we laughed. And Nelson says, I said to my wife, that I said the sentence was life, life to live. I don't speak such literary English. And it wasn't my wife, she was in England. It was my mother. And I said, life, life is wonderful. I was 31 years old. I'm now 76, so it's 45 years later. And I want to tell you, life is wonderful.
Well, we felt happy and proud that at least, although the propaganda outside by the government was that we were terrorists, murderers, rapists, and we knew we had none of those things. And people knew why we were arrested, what we were fighting for. And you know, that feeling that the majority of people in the country, especially blacks, know that we are not thieves. We were not arrested for having stolen something, but we are fighting for freedom. That feeling kept us going.
My feeling when we were sentenced to life imprisonment was, I'm going to live. I'm not going to die in prison. Apartheid's going to die before me. I was absolutely convinced of it. We were taken outside into our great big truck to go back to the prison. It took a long time to get ready because there was such a huge crowd outside. And as we came out, they were singing Nkosi Sikelel. They were shouting, you will not serve out your sentence. My belief as well. Got to the prison, I was put into a cell. I knew I'd be processed. I packed up my private clothes, I smoked a few cigarettes, and just waited for them to check me in.
Must have been midnight. The door started opening, and they said, take a blanket or two and your belongings. So what's happening? He said, well, you'll hear later on. They handcuffed us and leg irons. I was shackled to Govan and Mbeki and handcuffed. And they took us to the military airport near Pretoria, put us on a military plane, and escorted, of course, by the police and the prison. And I suppose there was the military, but I can't say for sure. The pilots must have been military. And we landed on Robben Island on the 13th of June. That was Saturday.
This rock off Cape Town was to be home for most of them for nearly 30 years, Robben Island. Behind them, they left sorrow among their supporters.
And I would get upset. And I sometimes shed tears. And I would be reassured that I mustn't blame myself for it. And in any way, this judge, in sentencing them 20 years, didn't know the facts of life. And they would show way in which Africans do. After 3 years, George, after 3 years, we are going to be free. Many of them were not. They served their full sentences. But who was I to opt out of it after their optimism that things would come right?
There were no martyrs in the Rivonia trial, but the authorities dealt the liberation movement a hefty blow.
What happened is they managed to crush us. They managed to crush the liberation movement.
There was a lot of tension. There was always tension, and people steered away from politics for many years, actually, after that, because the country was infested with spies. If someone came out talking politics very strong, you started getting worried that, hey, maybe this person is a spy.
My wife and daughter, on the 11th of June 1964, we'd been found guilty, and we were waiting for the judge to sentence us the next day. And I don't need to explain their anxiety. You can see it in her eyes, can't you?
For the broken families left behind, this was merely the beginning of years of torment, persecution, and tears.
That's what I married. Yummy.
More than 4 decades on, Dennis Goldberg can raise a laugh. It masks the pain of separation from his wife, Esme. Like most of the Rivonia families, imprisonment was merely the beginning of a painful journey.
And one of the first letters I wrote to my wife, quite early on, was, "You're a young woman, I love you. I would love you to be there when I eventually come out, but I might never come out. So I want you to live as full a life as you wish to live. You must feel free to do so." And I say it out of love, not jealousy.
Behind most of the Rivonia Triallists was a strong woman. Andrew Mlangeni had been married to his wife, June Joanna, for nearly 14 years when he was imprisoned.
She was herself a member of the ANC. Very strong woman. I'm proud of her. There she is. She was still young there. She kept the house, the fires burning in this house for almost 27 years while I was away. Very strong woman. You should have heard about when they spoke at her funeral. There are many things I myself didn't know about my wife, the type of underground work she did when I was on Robben Island. I was amazed. I said, I've been so many years now out of prison with my wife. She never told me about some of these things. You can see how secretive people had become. But all that was as a result of the brutality of the police.
It was a huge sacrifice. Leaving his wife behind, my mother was still very young then, and leaving his young kids behind must have been very difficult for him.
Their daughter, Sylvia Mlangeni, who now works for the government in Johannesburg, remembers it all too well.
Tremendous pain, because at some point my mother couldn't work. When she found work, the police would discover that she was working at a certain place, and they would go there and mess everything up for her.
As the years went by, there were visits to her father on Robben Island.
Oh, I couldn't believe that it was him. He was in khakis. It was like a dream. It was like one is dreaming. And we didn't know what to say to one another at first. greeted one another behind the class. There was a phone. We spoke through this phone. And then he asked me how I was and when did I come back and how is everybody else. Time was very short. We were given, I think, 10 to 15 minutes to see him. It was like I was dreaming, you know. I would wake up in the dream and find that he was not there. It was like a dream. I cried, and when we went back to the boat, I had so many emotions. One thought said to me, jump into the sea. You don't have a father. You have struggled throughout your life when you were a kid. You're still struggling now because he's not there as a father. A father figure is something that each and every child needs. He's not there as a father. Maybe just let me die.
Even after reunion, the pain for the Rivonia families lingered. Dennis Goldberg was released from prison in Pretoria on the 28th of February 1985.
I was taken in the commanding officer's car. So proud, I'm taking you in my car. I've brought my car for you. So I kicked the tires and said, it's okay, it's a nice car, thank you. I mean, this nonsense. I was a free man, actually. I had my body receipt. And yet I was being taken to the airport under guard in a convoy with police. And we arrived at the airport. I was rushed into a VIP lounge.
The destination was Israel, where his beloved daughter Hilary was working on a kibbutz. Hilary had grown up worrying about her father. This was the day he was sentenced in 1964.
You know, all the years I was in prison, my daughter, who was 8 years old when I disappeared out of her life, she was my great supporter. She thought I was Robin Hood, taking from the rich to give to the poor.
This was the moment in Israel when the Goldberg family was reunited. In their joy, they sped off to look up an old comrade from Johannesburg, Arthur Goldreich, the former underground activist and tenant at Liliesleaf, who was now an academic in Israel.
And I was driven to a house with my wife and daughter who met me. And I come up the steps into this house, and suddenly there's a light goes on, and there's Arthur Goldreich. And he says, Dennis, the last house you were in was my house, the Liliesleaf house. And now the first house you're in after prison is also my house, says Arthur. And knowing a little bit about cameras and light, I turned him around, so I was in the light, and I said, Arthur, is it safe this time?
Life in freedom in London began well for Dennis Goldberg. The ANC gave him the job of marketing party T-shirts, which he turned into a thriving business. But the love from his daughter Hilary was to tear them apart.
But when I came out, she wanted to protect me. She'd open all my letters, hundreds of letters, because she said there's hate mail. And I said, Hilly, my letters have been opened all the time I'm in prison. Don't open my letters. You're controlling me. I'm free. She burst into tears. I want to protect you. She was interviewed and she said her father was her hero, but she hated him because he wasn't there when she needed me, because I wasn't there when she needed me. And this is a problem for all our kids, all of them. I've seen Nelson's eldest daughter from his first marriage go off on a television program exactly the same way. Our kids suffered, I want to tell you that. And she actually rejected me. It took her 4 years to come to terms with me, and she needed counselling to do that.
Sadly, in 2002, a father had to bury his daughter.
My daughter has since died. She left me a grandson. He's now 16 and brilliant and a great rugby player, and he's going to play fly-half for England, I hope. And if not, he'll play cricket for England.
Even those who escaped incarceration suffered pain and turmoil. Jimmy Cantor, a court colleague of Nelson Mandela's, was accused number 8 in the Rivonia trial.
Case was withdrawn against him, and he was free. He and Nelson exchanged ties. And Nelson, incidentally, was to be the godfather of Jimmy's first child, daughter, Tanya.
Walking from this court wasn't the end of his troubles, it was merely the beginning.
Jimmy eventually had a breakdown. His wife was very pregnant, about to give birth. His law practice was being destroyed. It was his brother-in-law who was the real activist. And yet, he didn't take the easy way out. What amazing courage that is, really and truly.
Jimmy Cantor refused to speak to many of his family and friends for years. He died in 1975 of a massive heart attack, aged 48.
He felt betrayed. What do you say? Only he was really hostile towards us for a long time in England. Well, he didn't live that long. But what do you say to somebody whose life you've ruined? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yep.
Guilt and pain appears to run through many of the lives of most connected with the Rivonia trial. Paul Goldreich, the son of Arthur Goldreich, who was the front for Liliesleaf, was caught up in the Rivonia raid when he was just 5 years old. For many years, the clinical psychologist who lives in England found it difficult to talk about it. Would he put his children through the same in the name of politics?
That's a very, very difficult question. Yeah, I think I would.
Why?
Now, I would never have, I'm surprised that I'm giving that answer, actually, because I would never have given that answer 3, 4, 5 years ago. Why? Because I don't think there's a choice in it, really, I think is the point. I think it chooses you.
Lessons, decisions, thoughts, reflections. All part of the legacy of Liliesleaf and the struggle. What does it mean to future generations? How do those who suffered feel now? So where does Liliesleaf fit into a modern South Africa? A society changed in a way that the activists who used to hide in this safe house would have smiled upon. All races mixing with abandon. This is a visit to Liliesleaf by pupils from nearby Crawford Preparatory School. A chance for youngsters to drink in their country's past. Most of them are more familiar with the internet than an armed struggle fought out before their parents were born. It's a lesson far from the classroom about South Africa's uncomfortable past.
I was really it was just disgusting. I really didn't like it, what they did to black people. It was really mean.
I think Nelson Mandela was a good man because he helped he helped for the freedom struggle in South Africa because of the government of South Africa was racist.
I think that he could be my role model because he fought for freedom for the whole country, and I think that that's really good, and he wasn't selfish.
This experience is all about teaching the youngsters about their country's apartheid past. where non-white South Africans were made to feel strangers in their own country.
They're horrified. They can't believe it. They've never heard anything so ridiculous in their entire lives. To them, it's the most natural thing in the world to just be together, joyously together. When I explained to them there were benches for white people, benches for black people, I've even got a photograph of my dad and me as a child sitting on a bench that said Europeans only. They think I'm talking absolute nonsense. When I explained your buses were different, green buses for black people, red buses for white people, they think I'm nuts.
Happy together because of a raid on this house that led to the trial of the century and eventual liberation. But it all could have been so different. Every story has its what-if scenario. So does Liliesleaf. Professor Phil Bonner of Wits University in Johannesburg has been studying the story around Liliesleaf and the Rivonia trial for more than 10 years. This is the what-if question. The police were due to raid Liliesleaf at 1:30 p.m. on July the 11th, 1963. They turned back to pick up a search warrant. At that time, none of the underground leaders would have been there. Instead, they arrived at 3 p.m. when everyone was there, a jackpot in the words of the police. So what if? So what if they hadn't turned back and missed everyone?
All of them, from what I could gather interviewing them, would have stayed in the country. They were committed to that. And of course Mandela also was committed to that. So I think that not all that much would have changed. The overall environment was utterly inhospitable for guerrilla struggle and armed struggle. Mozambique and Angola were still under Portuguese rule. Rhodesia was still under the Smith government. There was no place to infiltrate through. That only changed in 1974 and 1975. At the same time, more or less as the Soweto uprisings, that's when things shifted. There would have been a 5-year change in terms of the rhythm of the struggle, that is from 1962, perhaps 1965, 6, 7. Thereafter, I think it would have been the same.
So either way, this Rainbow Nation was on the way.
They are so natural and so normal, and I love their normality, without any bitterness. These children have absolutely no bitterness because their parents have not shared any bitternesses or hurt.
This is the kind of hopeful tomorrow that Nelson Mandela must have had in mind when he emerged from a lifetime of incarceration. This was the day outside Victor Verster prison near Cape Town that changed the course of South African history. February the 11th, 1990, a day of joy and celebration.
I suppose we're much more excited because his coming home was about him coming home to us, people who lived in Orlando West. Thousands of people poured in from all parts of Soweto and from other provinces, because on that day people thought he would be transported straight from Victor Verster prison to his home in Soweto. And so he had a huge congregation of thousands of people around the home and in streets near to the home, waiting, singing, ululating the whole day, waiting for Nelson Mandela to be released. There was an explosion of joy, of singing and dancing, buses hooting, taxis hooting, people on top of buses and cars, people hanging outside taxi windows. I have never, before that day and since that day, seen such euphoria.
It was a day that ended with a speech to thousands and the world through television in Cape Town. Crowds waited for hours. Millions of people around the world remember where they were on that day. A day that secured the name Nelson Mandela in the minds and imagination of the world, the most famous prisoner on the planet. It paved the way for negotiations for a democratic South Africa and finally elections on April 27th, 1994. A date that has gone down in history as Freedom Day, the final nail in the apartheid coffin, a day which the underground activists of Liliesleaf fought and suffered for.
That group of leaders represented an idea of leadership that was larger than life. This group of leaders was selfless. this group of leaders was pure in principle.
By the time Mandela was released, most of these leaders from Liliesleaf had been freed more quietly but with equal emotion. Andrew Mlangeni returned home to Dube in Soweto, the same house he was arrested in more than 27 years before. His daughter, Sylvie Mlangeni, remembers that day as if it were yesterday.
And then the police said, open the gate. The gate was locked. No. We're not going to open the gate. We are waiting for our leader. They didn't know him. We're waiting for our leader, and the leader was standing right there at the gate. No, the police said, open the gate. This is your leader. They said, no, we're not going to open this. And I heard the noise. I woke up and ran to the gate, only to find that it was him. I screamed, hey, open the gate, that's my father. That is then that they opened the gate, and I ran, I went to wake my mother up. Mama, Papa is here. What? Papa is here, wake up. She took a gown and put it on. We all ran to the gate. I ran to the neighbors, the whole street down, to say, hey, my father is back, my father is back. And everybody got dressed. It was very early in the morning. Most people got dressed and they all ran back to our house to see him. It was so exciting.
Andrew Mlangeni lives among his people in Soweto and is a serving Member of Parliament. He has opened this new constituency office in Diepkloof. He has 11 grandchildren, 9 great-grandchildren, and no resentment towards his captors.
So we are not bitter. We said, chaps, let's work together for the good of the country. Not for black people, not for white people alone, but for everyone in the country.
Accused number 1, Nelson Mandela, lives in quiet retirement in Cape Town. He still takes part in state functions, but rarely gives interviews.
One of Mandela's fears is that he will be forgotten. I have a similar fear that there will come a day when you have a generation of South Africans that has forgotten the important role that was played by someone like Nelson Mandela, the Rivonia Triallists, and others in the struggle, and why they did what they did. It is a fear I have myself. I only hope that in forgetting the individuals, future generations will not forget the deeds.
Dennis Goldberg is retired and lives in Hout Bay near Cape Town, a short drive from where he was born. He feels South Africa has taken great strides since democracy, but has reservations.
We live in a society where wealth somehow is the measure of what you are as a person. It's a nonsense. But that's the kind of society we live in. And the previous society was the model for this one. Really and truly. We Marxists say every society bears the birthmarks of the society from which it comes. That's the truth of today.
Ahmed Kathrada is retired from politics and lives in Johannesburg. He feels South Africa is work in progress.
90% of the kids are now at school. But we still have schools that are under trees, classrooms under trees. We still have hunger. We still have unemployment. We have people, although we've built over 2.5 million houses, not enough. We have electrified 80% of the houses. We have provided water, sanitation. But you think of the tens of thousands who haven't got that yet.
Of the other accused, Walter Sisulu died in Johannesburg in May 2003. Govan Mbeki died in 2001. At the time, his son Thabo Mbeki was head of state. Raymond Mhlaba died in 2005. Elias Motsoaledi died on the evening of the day Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black president in 1994. Lionel Rusty Bernstein died in 2002. He stayed in England beyond exile because he didn't want to be parted from his children again. James Cantor died of a heart attack in England in 1975. Percy Utah, the man who prosecuted them, died aged 90 in 2002. Mandela invited him to lunch while he was in power. Harold Walpe, a lawyer and activist who missed the trial by escaping from Johannesburg police cells, returned to South Africa in 1990 and regained his lost citizenship. He died in Cape Town in 1996, just short of his 70th birthday. Arthur Goldreich, Walpe's fellow escapee, was the man who played the front of a wealthy landowner at Liliesleaf so that his comrades could shelter safely. Now, in his 80s, he's an academic in Israel. In 2010, the organisers of Africa's first World Cup pledged to honour the Rivonia Triallists for their role in helping to create the democratic South Africa that helped attract the greatest show on earth.
If you look at the Rivonia Triallists and start with Nelson Mandela, he went into prison but did not give up on that vision, that hope and that dream that one day we'll have a democratic South Africa, a non-racial, non-sexist South Africa, and a South Africa that will be a respected member of the global family of nations. And this is what has happened. So the vision and the dream of the Rivonia Triallists is actually going to be played out during this World Cup and culminate on the 11th of July in the stadium in Johannesburg, not far from Liliesleaf Farm.
A World Cup final on the 47th anniversary of the raid on Rivonia, all part of the legacy that is Liliesleaf.
I think you need to have memorials, in a way, to those who've struggled against tyranny, and I see this place as a memorial to that, in one sense. I think you need to have places where people's minds can be focused very diligently on the way that human beings can oppress other human beings and what one group of human beings can do to another.
A reminder in bricks and mortar of the people who gave up their lives for their beliefs.
You know, Nelson Mandela says he walked a long road to freedom. I walked a few steps with him. Very honoured to have been able to. And the key, on the last page of that autobiography, he says, we must so live our lives that we respect and enhance the freedom of others. His whole life, my whole life, the lives of my comrades. That's what it's been about. And was it worth it? Every single day. I would not change it, except I don't want to get caught if I were to do it again.
Just one of the many stories locked in Liliesleaf, a house that changed history. A milestone in the walk to liberation for South Africa. In an age of world-weary cynicism about politics, it is a story that resonates all the more. The house where Nelson Mandela and his determined comrades flitted through the shadows to set a selfless example to the world of how the oppressed can free themselves.